welcome back. Thank you so much for your feedback on the last videos, talking about my free birth, my birth, just natural birth. That's just what it was. It was just birth. And also on my postpartum. I so appreciate it. I'm glad you guys like hearing this. And today we're going to talk about kind of comparing my experience in a hospital and a home birth. So let's get to it. Before we jump into it, I just want to clear up some questions that I had gotten if I had planned the whole time on birthing at home, or if my experience with the induction and the hospital staff is what kind of led me into birthing on my own at home. I think all along I had really dreamt and hoped to birth at home. I just wasn't exactly sure how that would look or if it would happen. There's definitely, and this is something I see underlying a lot of videos talking about unassisted birth or birthing at home without any medical providers, is there is that seed of doubt. I don't think anything is ever like 100% certainty. And if it is, I think they're lying to you in some way. But there is always kind of that seed of doubt that would come up. And some days I would be like, hell yes, I'm doing this on my own, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. Then there's days where it's like, oh my gosh, what if XYZ? That's always going to be the case when thinking about birth in general. I remember even just thinking about birthing in the hospital, there were times where I was like, oh, my first birth, I went in really with the intention to birth unmedicated, but there's that seed of doubt, like, what if I can't do it? What if I get in there and it's more than I expected? It's more intense, it's more challenging. What if? So it's the same, home birth or birthing in the hospital, you're always going to have those questions. I had really dreamt of birthing at home, and I'll be completely clear and transparent, like there was back and forth, I think, throughout my whole pregnancy, especially as we got to the end and I got to 42 weeks, 41, got my due date. First of all, I got to my due date and I was like, okay, this still isn't happening. 41 weeks still isn't happening. 42 weeks, it still wasn't happening. When I had that scheduled induction, it was just every cell in my body, every part of me was just a full-on no. And I have a pretty good connection with my intuition around most things, especially like myself, my health, my children. But this was the clearest it has ever been and the most loud and vocal. It was just a very full body no. Really hard almost to like even consider going against that when it was just so clear and loud in my body. Like, this is not how I'm going to give birth. So had it been my intention all along to birth at home autonomously? Yes. Did I have doubt and back and forth? Yes. I had started going to the doctor just because I was so sick, just to make sure that everything was healthy. So that's how I kind of got wrapped up in the whole medical system in the hospital in the first place. Looking back, I probably could have skipped that and had less stress and just kind of like really tended to myself and my needs. But here we are, and now we get to compare the two, hospital birth and home birth. I know after we gave birth, me and my partner were laying in bed with our new baby and just like soaking it up, and he just kept saying, like, I can't believe how simple that was. I can't believe how simple that was. Like, how did the hospital complicate it so much? And being a birth worker, it's something that I knew happened and I recognized, but I think really experiencing it for myself firsthand, what birth at home can be like, I see all of the ways in which the hospital really stole a lot of moments for us. And by all means, if you feel safest in the hospital, birth in the hospital. It's not so much that I didn't feel safe at the hospital that I chose to birth at home, but I wanted that experience. I really wanted the experience of completely uninterrupted, undisturbed birth, and what that would feel like, what kind of spiritual moment I could have, spiritual transformation that could occur for me. And that was something I was really carrying into this birth, is to truly birth a new timeline for me, my daughter, and the future of our female lineage. So that was my, real intention with birthing at home. And we'll just kind of go phase by phase of labor, I suppose. Early labor. Early labor, you're starting to have contractions, you're timing them, maybe on and off, you're timing them, seeing if they're building into consistency. And during this part, you would be like probably closer timing them. I remember the first birth of my son, I was like on that clock, like timing them, stressing myself out when they would go, slow back down, and then they would kind of pick back up, and just the normal fluctuation that happens in early labor with our contractions. And I'm watching my contractions, and if you're birthing in the hospital, you're going to be more cued in to this time frame, because you have that magical number they gave you of 5 minutes apart, lasting 1 minute long for 1 hour, which is great. And that's typically for most people a fairly good indicator that they're getting closer into active labor, because early labor can last anywhere from hours to days. For me, I am a long laborer, and it was about, with my son, it was about 2 days. This time it was about 1 day that I was like in early labor. So once you hit that 5-1-1, that kind of golden rule they give you for the hospital to go in, you would go into the hospital. Once you're in the hospital, they're going to, you go in. Typically they take you into like kind of a separate, smaller room before they put you in like the birthing room. At most hospitals they have this. So you go in and they like question you, like, oh, are you in labor? Are you really in labor? What's your contraction timing? What's this? And then they need some sort of evidence for themselves. So they will connect you to the monitor, maybe do a cervical exam. They want to have like real tangible proof that you're in early labor, which makes sense. I mean, they're an outside person, I get it. But I think what really threw me by surprise as a first-time birthing person in the hospital is I was like, why don't you believe me? Why aren't you listening to me and my experience in this birth? I'm having contractions. I have been timing them. I am in labor. And if I'm being honest, just from my own experience, and I feel like this is really common for a lot of people, I went to the hospital a little earlier than expected. And chances are, if you're not having like a precipitous or a really quick labor, but when you get in the hospital and you're in just early labor, things are going to slow down a little bit, because you're moving and you're changing surroundings. So your body's going to like kind of hold on to itself, be like, wait, let's wait a second. Are we really safe and comfortable in an okay situation to do this? Our bodies are so intelligent in that way. It's just incredible. But if you're birthing at home, early labor is like awesome. You can walk around your neighborhood. You can eat snacks. You can take a nap, play with your toddler. I know we took a lot of walks, trying to really get things going, because I was at 42 weeks and 2 days when that kind of started. So I was like, you know what, let's get this over with. I really didn't want to go anywhere much farther past 42 weeks. Not so much, I think, I was just like the wait, like physical waiting time, but also the heaviness that I felt on my mind, like, when is it going to happen? When am I going to go into labor? Was just getting heavy and intense, and it was getting really challenging for me. It really became a mental game past 41 weeks, and a game of trust with my intuition. So early labor at home, I had like nowhere to rush, nowhere to go, nothing to do other than just kind of wait and enjoy the experience. And I remember I have a short video, me, my son, and my partner were all in the kitchen dancing around. It's baby time. And we were just so excited that it was it was finally happening. I also, during this early labor, because I was at home and I had like no intention of leaving or going anywhere, I baked a birthday cake for us to enjoy after her birth. My son really loves cake. I love cake. It was something just to kind of take my mind off of early labor and distract me. Also keep me up and moving throughout the contraction so I could really continue with the labor and birth that was happening. So then at home, as things started to shift into more active labor, which was actually, it was the next day at this point. And I wouldn't, if I was going into the hospital, I wouldn't have gone into the hospital the first day where I was like kind of contracting. Just by timing, even just by timing purposes, they weren't that 511, so I wouldn't have gone until the following day. And I encourage anyone who's planning on birthing at the hospital, if your intention is to do it non-medicated, stay at home as long as you possibly can. That's going to be your best bet in avoiding any of those interventions that you're not desiring. So we're at home, things are switching into active labor. I'm able to, I was sitting on kind of the yoga ball, swaying, walking around a little bit, standing up really intensified and pick things up very quickly. So I would kind of shift between doing that and sitting on the ball when I needed a little bit of a break. And then kind of in the back of my mind, knowing that I'm a long laborer, I didn't want to like overextend myself and then be too tired when it came to like the pushing and actually delivery. For some reason, I was just really in my head about like losing energy, and that would be the reason, if any reason, that I would have to transfer to the hospital. So I wanted to maintain my energy, trying to really just, again, listen to my intuition, eat snacks when I felt hungry, have something to munch on, try to drink as much water as I could, just really fueling my body while still kind of transitioning into getting things moving by standing up and walking around. Leaning on and swaying with my partner it was really helpful in getting through some of the tougher contractions once they really started to build. But there was no cervical checks, no pressure to have any cervical checks, obviously. And nobody coming around like, oh, that looks uncomfortable. Do you want something? Which is what happened in the hospital. I was in the hospital, and so they did the cervical exam, saw that I was, probably 3 or 4 centimeters dilated at that point. And my contractions were not super steady, but they gave me some juice and told me to walk around. So already we have these interventions that are happening. We have these cervical checks that are really uncomfortable when you're contracting. And also at the time I didn't know you could say no to them. So I'm just like having all of these, like, just this extra touch and kind of invasive practices happening that at the time I really just didn't feel comfortable with, but didn't know there was an alternative. So after we walk around for a little bit, we're at the hospital trying to really get things going. At this point, it was like 3 a.m. when we had left to go there, so I didn't want to go home. Wanted to just like stay there and have the baby, because we are really taught to think of the hospital as a safe place for medical events, and which is true. I think the more education I've gained in birth, in labor, it's not so much a medical event. It can be, but I think most cases it is just a normal life event, a normal physiological thing that our bodies can do on their own. So that change in perspective also really led me to feeling confident in birthing at home. So we're checked into the hospital then. We move over into one of the kind of labor and birthing rooms, which is bigger, has more space, so like a couch, it's nicer. It was 4.5 years ago, so it's all a little bit fuzzy. But we're at the hospital, we're in the birthing room, and I really just remember being very tired. At this point, it had been like, this was going on day 3 of labor. The early labor, the 2 days before, it wasn't like super intense, but it was still interrupting my sleep a little bit. So I just physically, emotionally was feeling tired. I was just tired. So, let me preface this whole hospital, my first birth, I've always been really interested in birth and childbirth and all of that. So I read all the books, husband coach birthing, like everything I could possibly think of. I had a couple books that would later become my doula books, in partner supported birth and that whole realm of different laboring positions and that completely goes out the window when you're in labor, especially as a first-time mom. That's just not what you're thinking about. It's all such a new experience that you're kind of really just focused on that experience. So I'm in active labor, things are getting intense, and I remember just being in the hospital bed and rolling side to side. Every so often they would come in, they would want to check my cervix, tell me to roll to the other side, and it was just a lot of cervical checks. Eventually my oxygen levels had kind of decreased a little bit. No, the baby's oxygen levels had decreased a little bit, and put on an oxygen mask. At the time, it was like the most uncomfortable thing I could possibly imagine doing. I kept like taking it off, and I remember my mom being there like, no, you need to wear this, you need to put this on, like, but it was just so uncomfortable. And I think it was really my body telling me like, you don't need this isn't necessary. And looking back at this part of my labor in the hospital, I can see that it was probably just the stress of the environment. I had tried, I knew all the things that created the best environment for birth, like a dark, quiet space, minimal interruptions, and all of that. And I don't believe I communicated that clearly enough with my birth team, my partner, or my mom, or the hospital, what my true desires were. So I'm sitting in a fairly well-lit hospital room, being interrupted, and I think I was just getting stressed. Like it was just this really like back and forth with my body, like this is an okay place to birth. Mentally I'm thinking that like I'm safe to birth here, it's okay, because that's what I had been led to believe. And then my body really being like, no, this is not the ideal place that we should be birthing. So it's really just this back and forth between those two kind of arenas. I also kind of looking back, and there's no way I can prove this or anything, but I do believe it was a little bit of a setup that was leading me to potentially have more interventions than I did. There was often the nurses would be like, can I get you something for pain? Is there anything I can get you for pain? A handful of times, probably almost every time they came in, that was something that came up, which I understand coming from their perspective, and knowing now that they don't see a lot of non-medicated births. It would be strange for them and probably uncomfortable for them to watch somebody be so uncomfortable as it is in labor, rather than really acknowledging it as just a powerful experience for that person. We're trying to make them comfortable by like removing the experience entirely. So a few kind of like afterthoughts that I had about my hospital birth, and some of these happened like years after I gave birth at the hospital. Some of them were more more recent to the event itself. But yeah, I think it would like my baby's oxygen rates lowering and it being stressed was a result of the environment and what was happening, not that my body and I was doing something improperly, which is what I think I was kind of led to believe with the oxygen mask. Then we move into late active labor, kind of that transition phase. In the hospital, it was much different than my experience with it at home. In the hospital, I was, again, at this point, just completely exhausted. Really, I think my body was just like trying to rest and sleep in between contractions. I remember just like sleeping, essentially. And so late active labor, kind of early transition phase in the hospital was just way different than my experience with it at home. In the hospital, again, I'm just like exhausted at this point. I'm in the hospital bed. No, and just kind of again rolling side to side every like 20 minutes or a half hour. I remember they would come in and be like, okay, we need time to rotate, time to switch sides. And that was kind of their way of still keeping some movement happening. I wish somebody would have been like, hey, why don't we try to go for a walk, or why don't we try some of these positions. Locally, I have seen hospitals and the nursing staff be more proactive about things like that in recent births that I've attended, but at the time of my birth, that was never offered. It wasn't an option, and it was it's kind of how it is. And it also, I hate to say this, but it also could have been that because a doula was present, that they were like, okay, let's play by the rules, let's do all the things to help this person birth as they wish to, and to get them moving, get labor moving on, kind of, I don't know, just very much following like the doula handbook is how I see nurses act when a doula is present. So really not a whole lot different. I remember being very clear and in my head before I gave birth in the hospital for my first birth about contractions being like a minute long. I knew they were a minute long, and I knew I could do anything for a minute. I've always been pretty active and like exercising. I enjoy exercising, so I know I can put my body through some stressful things for a minute in length and get over it. I really carried that mindset with me into birth at the hospital, and I also carried one key thing that like at transition, which is pretty much the end of labor before pushing starts, at transition you're going to think and feel like you can't go on anymore, that like you just want it to be over with. And I remember being in the hospital and having that thought and thinking, okay, I'm doing this, it's almost over, we're almost done. Like I just remember like kind of celebrating that internally. I didn't say anything externally, this was all like in my head. And I think it was shortly before that point where I really surrendered to my body and to what was happening while I was in the hospital. Had I done that before, like earlier on in labor, it probably would have made things easier for me. But overall, it really wasn't as bad as I thought, to be honest. And that was the first thing I said after I gave birth as well. That wasn't as bad as I thought with my first labor. So that was, again, just my experience. I didn't have any sort of, real medical interventions other than the oxygen. It wasn't an induction or anything like that. And inductions are really where things can ramp up as far as discomfort and contractions and those sorts of things, which is why I so strongly think we should really consider what the risks are when we're getting an induction and if it is like truly medically necessary. So flip-flopping over to my home birth, kind of late active labor, early transition, we had set up the birthing pool. I was really on the fence about getting a birthing pool because I had seen some of my clients like love the birthing pool. They, like don't want to get out of it. It's just like a really great tool for them in coping with the discomforts of labor. I've also had women like try to get in the tub or pool or shower or whatever it is and like not be into it at all. It's just not comfortable. So I didn't know what to do. We have a very small house, so there's not like a lot of room for a birthing pool or tub. I knew my bathtub was way too small, and the shower, like our bathroom is just very small. So if that was something that I was gonna like I needed the birthing pool, and it was just very back and forth. I ended up finding like a kiddie pool on Amazon for like $50, and I was like, you know what, let's try it. Worst case scenario, I don't like it and we have a pool for our son for the summer, like that'll work. So I get in the pool and it was incredible. I was just like the edge that it took off of the contractions. I was still contracting and I could feel that they were building, they were getting stronger, closer together, but I was just like more comfortable. I was so much more comfortable, and I did not expect that kind of like great relief to happen with the birthing pool. Like, it just felt very good. It was also a sign that I was in active labor because things weren't slowing down. They were still picking up, and actually they picked up more so once I got in the pool. And I think I was just able to relax a little bit more because of that, the warm water, and it just took a little bit of the edge off of the contractions. So I really labored in there for most of my active labor, kind of using that as my tool. Again, there weren't any cervical checks or anything like that happening. There was one point, having all of the knowledge that I have around birth, I probably got in my head a little bit too much, but I know, and I think in my first birth, this was part of an issue. Part of it as well is my bladder was very full. I had been drinking, but I hadn't been going to the bathroom. So I'm like trying to relieve myself in the birthing pool, and I just couldn't. So I had to get up and go to the bathroom. And I knew sitting on the toilet was going to be helpful, one, in me going to the bathroom, but also as being kind of the labor throne that it is. It, you know, our pelvic floor and everything just really relax, and getting out of the pool and having kind of that cushion that the water provided, the contractions were harsh. They were so just like sharp. Is like the only way I can describe it, is like the water like softened those sharp edges, but outside of the water it was sharp contracting pain, and it was really consistent. So I knew I was kind of getting in, like moving through that transition phase. I hadn't yet had the thought like, I can't do this, this is too much. But so I get back in the birthing pool, things are going good. I'm starting to kind of have thoughts as things continue, like, oh, I don't know if I can do this, like I just want this to be over. I was starting to get a little bit tired, which is like, I made it through pretty much the whole labor process at this point without getting really tired. And it was actually our birth attendant, like, do you have any popsicles? Do you have any honey? Like trying, I think she probably saw it in me. And knowing that pushing was coming up next, like just to get some energy in me, some sugars to kind of help me finish this whole process out so my body can keep working as hard as it had been. But otherwise, I really was kind of left alone to my own devices to float in the birthing pool, kind of shifting positions every so often. But largely just like relaxing and knowing that my body was doing what it needed to do to make the room and open this space for the baby to come into the world. Then moving through transition, there's like a quiet phase that happens in labor, at home or anywhere. And I remember I was in this like kind of quiet phase when I was in the hospital. I was in that resting phase in between labor and pushing, and I had my cervix checked and the water broke. It may have been close to breaking on its own, I don't know, but it was like right when she went in there, and she was like, oh, I don't know. It felt like she had broke my water, which was fine because labor was almost over anyway, but it just was an unnecessary thing that happened. So she broke my water, and again at the hospital, I'm so tired. I'm really like sleeping through the contractions. As soon as my water break, I remember, again, I don't know how, I have no idea how long of a time difference this was, but then the doctor came in and I was like, okay, you're at 10 centimeters, it's time to push. And at the time I wasn't really feeling pushy, and so I was just kind of like, okay. And then, we kind of waited for the contractions, and at first, one thing I'm really grateful for, she did let me direct the pushing, so it wasn't like a coached pushing. If I had been struggling, I would imagine they probably would have been more coached pushing. I've seen labors where doctors do coached pushing, but Once my water broke and the doctor was in the room, the contractions did start to feel a little bit different. It was more of like that urge to push. So with the contractions, I would wake up, I would push as hard as I could, and I'd fall back asleep. I think I pushed for my first birth, it was like, I think it was like an hour of pushing. I would say it was about an hour of pushing. And there was no like ring of fire that you hear about, like so often you hear about. And I remember right before he was born, she asked, she was going to do Pitocin. And my partner had read all the books and like put little flags, and it was so sweet. He read all the books, took notes, and like tagged the pages that were important. But he knew my plan was really no medical interventions. So she just said that they were going to do this, and Daniel was like, are you sure this is what you want? Which is like the perfect response you can have. If you're birthing and your plan is to birth with a medical provider, have your partner know your plan, and if something deviates that, just have them default into asking you, is that like, are you sure you want that? Because it puts the medical provider in a place like, oh, are you okay with this? Then they ask for your actual consent so you can verbalize for yourself like, no, I don't want this. At the time, I was so tired. I knew the Pitocin was going to do a couple things. One, I knew they were giving it to me because of postpartum hemorrhaging, which as a first-time mom and not being super informed, I was like, I don't want to bleed to death. Like, sure, give it to me. And I also knew it was going to make my contractions stronger. Artificially so, but again, I was so tired at this point. I was like, anything to help me keep pushing and get this baby out, I'm fine with. So it really probably wasn't many pushes after that my son was born. And then pushing at home was way different because you don't have somebody telling you like, oh, you're 10 centimeters now, you can start pushing. I was in the pool and I started to feel kind of pushy. But the whole end of my pregnancy and early labor, like I could feel her head very low. I really didn't even have to like reach into my vagina very much. Like her head was very low. And then when I got to that pushing stage, I'm on kind of like a low squat on my feet in the pool, and I couldn't feel her head anymore. And again, like really reverting back into like my educator brain, I know that if the head's not present, like real pushing isn't going to be very productive, and it's also going to, one, tire me out, which I was trying to avoid with the whole home birth. Is for some reason, and I don't know why, I saw that as being my biggest hurdle, and I would get too tired and would have to transfer, probably because I was so tired in my first labor. But I really didn't want to overextend myself. So I'm able to just take my time, kind of push a little bit when the contractions like felt more of like that urge to push. But it really was more of just like a kind of bearing down and trying to like let my body move the baby as far down as possible. It was actually our birth attendant, and which I'm so grateful for her. If you're watching this, thank you. You know, for suggesting and reminding me to keep changing positions. That's something that doesn't happen in the hospital. Like, yeah, flip back and forth, whatever, but there were so many other positions I could have tried and things we could have done in the hospital that weren't suggested to me. And not that I hadn't learned them, but I had just forgot about them when you're in that moment. And even today now, with my second birth, earlier on in the labor, I knew to keep changing positions. But I think we just find a position that's comfortable and we want to stay there, which can be good as well. But we do need to, if things slow down labor-wise, we need to remember to keep moving. I was much more in that mind space of surrender and just kind of letting the contractions happen to me rather than, you know, like like, oh, here they come, you know, and like kind of bracing myself. My home birth surrendered completely to the whole process and let them just kind of gently, as gently as possible, flow through me and move the baby. So that early transition, there were definitely moments where I'm like, you know what, why am I birthing at home? Let's fuck this and just go to the hospital. I'll get a cesarean. You know, we can walk in, tell them how far along I am. They'll do it right away. But then I remembered, you know, kind of my real intention here was to birth this new lineage of power and, yeah, really just power in our female lineage. So I continued with the whole like kind of bearing down, lightly pushing when I felt called to, but I just really didn't have this like real urge to push. And the birth attendant suggests I change positions. You know, like things were going really good when you were more on your hands and knees. At this point, I was just kind of like reclining and letting the contraction do its thing, let my body do its thing, and just kind of being the passenger along this journey. So I flip over then onto kind of hands and knees. I'm leaning against the birth pool with my arms. I guess kind of like a low squat position again, and I just feel it was really almost like this outer body experience. I knew I needed to stand up. So I stand up, and it feels like almost as soon as I stood up, her head just like popped right out, and I reached down, and it really was like this moment of shock. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's her head. So it was a completely different experience as far as, you know, birthing and pushing. I wouldn't really say like I pushed. I was in like that bearing down, kind of pushing state for, I think our attendant had said about 2 hours, but it wasn't like I was pushing these 2 hours. I was really just letting the contractions do their thing. And then I stand up, I feel her head, you know, after kind of that initial shock wears off, like, oh my gosh, this is her head, like we're at the end of this, like what is, like, oh my, it was just like complete shock, and just this outer body experience really. And I was like, and then it was like I got sucked back into my body, and it's like, okay, let's finish this. I think it was maybe 2 like strong pushes. I caught her and I brought her out into the world, and kind of leaned back into the tub. And that was it. That's how she came into the world. My son in the hospital, as soon as the head was out, and this is common as I've seen in the births that I've supported, the care provider will grab the baby's head, help it twist, so its shoulders twist, so they're like twisting the baby's neck. Babies are super flexible, so it's not like hurting them, but it is really kind of scary, like kind of nerve-wracking, I guess, to see, like, you know, like they grab the baby's head, twist it so its shoulders turn, and pull the baby out. Whereas I felt my daughter's shoulders shift to be sideways and come in, you know, like babies naturally do this dance in the pelvic to help them be born. In the hospital, that's interrupted, and we're pulling babies from moms. The last part of birth, of course, is the placenta. In the hospital, part of this is probably the Pitocin that helps kind of release it, but they don't let it just come naturally. They kind of tell you like, oh, push a little bit, but then they're pulling it out. From what I've seen as a birth attendant, they're pulling the placenta out of you rather than letting it be born on its own time. And when we are pulling it out, it's causing more of a chance of hemorrhaging if the placenta isn't fully ready to be released. Part of it will hang on there, which is going to cause infection later on, or it could cause hemorrhaging if we're taking, you know, really yanking on it before it's ready to come. So it causes more damage than good. It was probably about 45 minutes after I gave birth, I was so uncomfortable. I thought with my first birth that the relief that I felt was in just birthing of my son, but it was actually in birthing of the placenta. That is like when the real wave of relief washes over you. In the hospital, those two events, the birth of your child and the birth of the placenta, are so close, you don't notice it. But at home, I had this space to really notice it. Like, I was so relieved when she was born, of course, and she's crying and everything is good. But there was just way more relief in getting the placenta out, which took about a half hour to 45 minutes. And I had taken some herbal tincture to help to assist me with that, because again, I was just really uncomfortable. It was cramping, and not in like the contraction way, but like in just a really uncomfortable, like cramping, get this out of me sort of way. So I birthed the placenta next to my bed. I had gotten out of the pool at this point, gone to bed, just to kind of like relax. And I remember from some of my training that like it's sometimes easiest for the placenta to be born not in the water. So that was kind of my intention there. Is like, maybe if I get out of the pool, things will like pick up and the placenta will come. Maybe if I nurse my baby, the placenta will come. So I'm trying all these different things. Eventually it's that tincture and kind of gently tugging and pulling, like I felt it drop almost, like the fully release. And then I squatted down and just pulled it out the rest of the way. And kind of looked it over. It looked complete. There was like no like chunks missing or anything like that. And that was my first time looking and like really seeing a placenta. So it was super cool. Just a really cool experience for me. I had seen placentas, of course, at the hospital, but they don't let you like really look at them. So I got to like really check it out and look at it. And at this point, yeah, my daughter we cut the cord pretty early, because soon after she was born, like immediately I started feeling my uterus like cramping down. But I got to do it all in my own time. The biggest part that was different is in the postpartum experience. In the hospital, as soon as the baby's born, they take it away. They're doing all the tests and measurements and all of that stuff. Well, the doctor is like potentially stitching up any tears that you may have had. And I did have tears, and I do think I had tears, one, because of the Pitocin, and two, because of her pulling him out of me, which wasn't necessary. Like, there was no reason for that to happen. I didn't have any tears at home, and she just literally like really quickly slid out. You know, I really did a lot of laboring and bearing down. So like I think like that is part of what made it easier for me. And there were no tears because of that, because I gave my body time to stretch. At home, I didn't feel the pressure. I didn't feel like I was on a time frame for pushing, whereas in the hospital, they kind of do put you on a little bit of a time frame for overall labor length, even though there's no evidence, scientific evidence, research, or study that support labor should be a certain amount of time for healthy results for mother and baby. I really had my time to move through the entire labor process. Postpartum, there was no interruption at all. We did measure her and see how long she was. Otherwise, like, she was healthy, she was crying, she nursed pretty much almost like immediately right away. And then it was about an hour or so, our birth attendant left, and it was just us. We were laying in bed. It was like 11 o'clock at night at this point, and we just rested. And that was all. You know, it felt so normal and simple. And, you know, my partner kept saying, like, I can't believe how simple this was. Like, why do they make it so complicated? And I don't know why they make it so complicated. I mean, I can throw out some guesses and quote unquote conspiracies, but there's really no reason to complicate something that naturally, physiologically happens on its own. So I hope this video was helpful in kind of comparing the difference between a hospital birth and a home birth. At a home birth, you get way more freedom of movement, of choices, of time. But I think for me, the biggest key piece was in that postpartum that I wanted to really, it's such a sacred period of, I think of like some of the airports that have recombobulation areas. Like it's such a sacred recombobulation time where like mother is coming back together from this journey, baby is adjusting to this world, father is like trying to take in everything that he just witnessed. And it's just this like trifecta of human, of people like having this really human experience and trying to find themselves in it. And at the hospital, that's taken away from us. So much of that postpartum is just taken away. So much of the process of labor is taken away. And I contribute a lot of the small things that happened in the labor that really set me up to, one, not trust my intuition as a mother from the get-go, but also in kind of like seeding these thoughts that like I couldn't do it, or I wasn't enough, it wasn't possible, my body wasn't functioning, which would lead me into, in part, into my depression that followed my first birth. And in part, and in many ways, that really kind of negative, not that it was negative, because after I gave birth to my son in the hospital, I was like, wow, that wasn't as bad as I expected, because it wasn't. It was much less painful and easier than I thought it would be to give labor. Like, we hear all these horror stories about it, but as I sat with it over the years and I found myself in this depression and wanting to really serve mothers and realizing that the hospital birth and the hospital system isn't setting us up to be confident, competent mothers, like to feel good about ourselves and really trust our intuition, because from the very beginning of our child's life, they're already causing us to question it. So if I hadn't had that experience with the minor negatives, really minor compared to like some major birth traumas that I've witnessed and heard, it led me into full force throwing myself into the birth work and learning about the womb and the women's cycle and how labor naturally progresses and physiologically unfolds, how our hormone system works during it all. I'm finding all these things that I carried with me into the birth of my daughter, and I knew that her soul, her spirit, which I had been connected with, needed this, that we were going to birth in a powerful way for both of us to really set a new timeline for the females in our lineage. And I'm so grateful for that experience. And I know I speak from privilege in that I had this experience, privilege of knowledge, of resources, of now I do take her to the doctor for some like basic checkups and that sort of thing. I have in this past month, and knowing that I'm not like berated with questions as to why I birthed at home when I was seeing a physician for so many months throughout my pregnancy. There's a lot of privilege that I have in this experience, and being healthy enough to do so is like the biggest one. So I'm so grateful for that, and I hope this video lands with the people that it needs to, that you have kind of the insight in between hospital and home birth. If you're on the fence, try home birth. Try it. Just try it. You can always, if you're, unless you're like hours away from a hospital, chances are you're not that far from a hospital that could assist you if something medically did go wrong. So try it. And if something comes up, big if here, you can always go to the hospital. But chances are your body is going to be able to do this exactly as it's meant to, and you'll feel so powerful strong and just wild and free. Like, I remember feeling so free and wild, just like a badass. So that's my experience comparing the two. And I would love to hear your experience of either home birth or free birth, birthing at home, any of your birth stories. I want to hear them. If you have any questions or anything else you want me to talk about, leave it in the comments, and I'll talk to you all soon.